Hello, hello, and welcome back to another episode of Overpowering Emotions, where I talk all things big emotions, emotion regulation, resilience. I am in a little self-regulation mini series, even though really everything I talk about is related to self-regulation, but I'm focusing specifically on this because it is the foundation of all of our kiddos' success and well-being. And so we really want to make sure we're focusing on this ability to manage one's thoughts and feelings to enable goal-directed actions, right? So that's organizing our behavior, controlling impulses, solving problems constructively, doing whatever it is that we need to do to be successful with whatever it is we're supposed to be doing in the moment. Now, while I talk about effective interventions a lot, we can talk about the most effective things, exactly everything that you need to do all day long. Success is really shaped by the world around a child, right? It's all of these contextual elements, which I want to focus on today. It might be a little bit boring, some of us just want to jump into those interventions. But like I said, if we're not addressing those contextual factors, it doesn't matter what interventions we're using. We do know that a lot of these interventions, and I'm saying kids, but this includes our adolescents, which goes right up into adulthood, that young adulthood. It is effective. It doesn't matter where we're working on it. We could be working, at home, in the community, in school settings, right? We want to be working on this ideally across all of settings. And we know self-regulation is important for all kids. It doesn't matter if they just have a diagnosis of ADHD or autism or anxiety or all of the above, right? It doesn't matter if they have behavioral challenges or not, or personality disorders or not, or trauma or not. It's really important for all of us, all people, even adults too. Now, obviously, there are kiddos who have bigger gaps, right? So the more severe self-regulation difficulties that they have at baseline, they certainly have more room to move, so to speak, in terms of improvement, especially if they are at higher risk of anxiety or behavioral conduct problems or those types of things. So certainly there's more room to improve, but all kids need to work on this. Prevention programs don't really have a lot of effect in the community specifically, and so that's why we want to really target school. School is a great place for prevention programs, and that's why I am trying to get up and running a pilot program, hybrid private program for prevention when we're looking at anxiety and emotion dysregulation. So definitely reach out if you're interested in that. That's, really my research goal, looking at schools to support that homeschool. All the context, all of the people, educators, and parents are all learning the same things to support kids' self-regulation and their resilience. Now, self-regulation is certainly an internal capacity, but its development, its use is really dependent on the environments, predictable, responsive, supportive environments. Predictable, responsive, supportive relationships are part of those environments too. I've talked a lot about the family environment, which we know is a crucial component, especially for developing emotional self-regulation. Self-regulation develops through observing other people. It's learned through those warm, responsive interactions with our caregivers, right? And with the broader environment and others modeling those behaviors over time. So that's really important. So the important adults in a kiddo's life, and it certainly caregivers, parents, but that includes teachers, mentors, coaches, anybody who's grandparents, extended family, they all play a critical role in supporting that self-regulation development. Okay, so their support really includes lots of different things, providing structure, providing guidance, providing coaching, right? This is all part of that co-regulation. We can't regulate for them, but we are there for the guidance and the structure, right? And I talk about this all the time. But if kids are consistently relying on adults to externally regulate their emotions, that can develop into a habit that really hinders their own self-discipline, hinders their own growth and, brain pathways. It's hindering their brain development. It really is an internal process. We are just there to support the process. So it really is a balance, right? And that's why it's co-regulation, not we are regulating for you, right? We're not regulating for the child. That's just a major trap that we see all of the time where we are jumping in and taking over, trying to get them to calm down and feel better, but we're not allowing them to rely on their own internal capacity. So if you really want to put in an intervention into place, right? It's really here. about how are other people helping them co-regulate so that kids can increase their own capacity. I talk a lot about effective communication. We got to stop talking, for example. This is really important, and this is why I really wanted to focus on this because a lot of the interventions are specifically enhancing kids' internal capacity. They're not focusing on the parent or the teacher or the other adult skills to support that co-regulation, right? In preschool years, in those early years, certainly that's where we focus all of our, parent training, and we know that's the best sort of intervention before they're 5, right? But there's a substantial drop off in these types of approaches as children age once they get into school. And that's why I really wanted to pilot this program for this reason. Certainly, kiddos are working on skills, but it's really about the adults in the kid's life. And it's not fair for me to work on a kid's skills just to put them back into a chaotic environment where there isn't any co-regulation support and the adults are screaming and yelling and, swearing and slamming doors. It's not going to be helpful. We know that adults' own self-regulation abilities are linked to their capacity to provide co-regulation, and it really affects outcomes for kids. So parents with regulatory difficulties often contribute to emotional dysregulation, harsher discipline. We're not teaching kids anything, right? It's also associated with things like lower parental executive function. So really improving self-regulation for the parents, that's a target. We want to prevent harsh discipline. We want to prevent just the household emotional upset all the time. Peer and social influences are really important too. And I am actually next week going to talk about how we can leverage that peer support in a positive way. We know that there's strong theoretical potential for self-regulation development within the peer context. And I say theoretical because there's not a lot of interventions that are systematically involving peers in promoting self-regulation for youth, right? They're not really engaging partners, for older youth who might be dating, for example. Why not leverage those important people as well? So these are key areas that we could really focus on. It's still theoretical, right? We don't have a lot of research on that, but that's an important piece that we can start looking at. And that's why I want to focus a little bit more next week, just to give some ideas of how we can really leverage that peer support. The social emotional competencies really rely on abilities like managing frustration, seeking help from peers, even, right? Seeking help from adults, but seeking help from peers, articulating our feelings within relationships. A lot of times, kids, they're in these separate groups. They're attending them in the community. It's not really helpful. Kids aren't generalizing those skills. That's why I don't do social skills. They're not generalizing those skills in the real world where they need to use them on the playground with their classmates, right? At recess time. So we really want to make sure we're targeting this in their natural community, in their natural environment. Right? It's really important. So, like I said, that's why I'm going to just talk specifically about how we can leverage that peer piece. Of course, adversity and stressors are also important to consider. If youth who experience adversity often are more resilient, but they usually need more co-regulation support because they might not have had a lot of good modeling, for example, or people in their lives who could do that co-regulation. And so a lot of times they don't have access to those resources. They don't have access to those positive environments in the world to really help support their self-regulation development. So yes, they're resilient, but they might not have that self-regulation capacity. So stress and challenges, even just in caregivers' lives, can really adversely affect their own self-regulation capacity, making interventions for kids therefore less effective, especially if they're not modeling or scaffolding those types of skills. There's biological vulnerability, right? Potentially influenced by early traumatic experiences and early stressful life events that can be linked to difficulties with emotion regulation as well. We know screens is a major stressor. That's definitely disrupting our kids' ability to self-regulate. So if we are, battling with screen issues and screen dependency, it's going to be really hard to also be working on self-regulation. Just like I would tell a client, right? I don't know how to work on this stuff if you are addicted to drugs. We need to work on the drug addiction, right? It's the same sort of thing. We're only going to make incremental, tiny little bit of progress if there's other things going on, like, this dependency, because you're turning off your brain. You're never needing to use your brain to self-regulate. The minute you're feeling stressed, if you go onto a screen, that's really hard for us to be working on this, right? Maybe in our session, that's not going to be enough. You need to be working on it all the time, every day. So that's really important to think about. Developmental factors, right? Self-regulation is a developmental process. It evolves from birth through to young adulthood, and it strengthens over the life course, even into late adulthood. So we can see different interventions having impact at different ages. Okay. And I talked a little bit about this before, but we do see major shifts in that self regulation capacity within the first 5 years of life because they're developing a lot more motor skills and cognitive skills. But even babies at 2 months old, they're starting to self soothe. They'll look away. If there's something overstimulating, they'll look away. That's a way for them to learn, like they're starting to learn how to manage and self soothe and self regulate a little bit. Adolescence is a really important period for emotion regulation. I mean, we want to do all the prevention work. We want to make sure we're teaching kids those skills early on, but we definitely want to be practicing because there's so many developmental changes, from physical development. We see increased interpersonal salience, more demands for autonomy. There's heightened emotional stress. So the adolescence years is a great time to really make sure that we're addressing this because oftentimes if it's left unmanaged, that's why we see so many adults who are struggling later in life because they never learn these skills. And so we want to make sure we're managing this. There's major changes happening in the brain. The whole brain architecture is changing during adolescence. So it's a really important time to make sure we're targeting, right? But it's really effective from 2 to 17. Absolutely, we need to be addressing this. But even into adulthood, that's important, right? It's just easier in the younger years because there's usually adults who are there who are helping us co-regulate, who are helping us practice, whereas adults were not necessarily doing those things. Mindfulness-based interventions, I know I've talked about this recently. It definitely seems to be a factor. Younger kids might show larger improvements using mindfulness in terms of some of those negative behaviors, right? So for behavior management. For teenagers, the greater benefits of mindfulness is related specifically to those executive functions, possibly due to the heightened brain plasticity that we're seeing during the sort of window of opportunity. There's so much going on in the brain. Now, one thing that we need to think about it for the interventions, it tends to be more diffuse and briefer as they get older than it is for younger kids, which isn't really aligned with developmental neuroscience, right? So we might not see great improvements. If we are just giving them lots of information in a brief amount of time, that's not super helpful for our teenagers, right? A lot of interventions don't spend enough time either specifically on emotion regulation and interventions when we're looking at those teenagers, even though we know that this is so important. That's why I focus so much of my training on this, because it's so important. It overrides the cognitive side of things, but most people, as they get into those teenage years, are focusing more on the cognitive types of strategies, which aren't as helpful. We know that the developing brain during childhood and those teenage years, it really presents like more, obviously, plasticity. It's just conducive for practicing and implementing those strategies. And there's a lot of neurobiological changes in those brain circuits, especially the brain circuits involved in the emotional processes that are parallel, right, when we're looking at the development of emotion regulation during this time. Youth are shifting away from parental support to those internal regulatory processes. So again, it's another reason why we really want to focus on this, right? But we want to establish those good, healthy habits early on, understanding what those skills are. So just some things to think about. Of course, if they're, I can't I've talked about this lots. If they're tired, if they're hungry, if they're in pain, it doesn't matter what our interventions are. So we definitely want to address those types of things as well. But I'll leave it there for today. I think it's all common sense, but it's just a good reminder for us to think about. So as always, have a great day. Help those kiddos be bold and courageous. And I will see you next time where I will be going into the peer, how we're going to leverage that peer piece. Have a great day.